Hey, good afternoon.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, long time. How you doing?
Okay, as always, we give people a couple more minutes to join here. Now we have 2 people from Sivo here.
Yeah, I noticed my company's changed since the last attendance.
Yeah, let's maybe give people at least a couple more minutes. Otherwise, we can spend more time today really discussing the enablement working group today. Some might watch offline, or some might have not realized that we actually put it 1 week off. Which was mostly because of me, because I was not there last week. And yeah, the official TUC vote on new chairs and tech leads is still open, which by the way was my fault. That is still open because I didn't put vote into the email, so nobody voted. I mean, it's kind of like an awkward thing, but I was wondering why is nobody voting, and then I talked to Amy, and she said, "Well, if you're not right vote, nobody is voting." So that, okay, but there's now an issue, and this should be moving forward pretty quickly. And if there was some confusion, so the internal vote was done with current chairs and TOC liaison, and this is just the official TOC approval. I think vote is maybe the wrong term there. Just need the official okay from the TOC. Yeah, I think even while we get started here, let's just, while we're waiting for probably a couple more people to join here, just jump into the app enablement working group proposal. This is actually perfectly in time because next Tuesday there's the next TOC meeting where the working group should also present an update. So I think this is perfectly in time. Maybe we can also spend some time on the operator white paper if we still need to. We can pick either one to go first. Maybe operator white paper would be really quick, I assume. We can't hear you, Jennifer.
You're very silent.
We can see you talking, but we can't hear what you're talking to.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
There we go.
Now we can hear, yes, that's good.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Related to the operator white paper, there is a pull request with the narrative voice submitted. It has got the reviews, that like enough reviews, so it's just needing to push that and get it into the public comment phase for the TOC to approve. So it should emerge today, and then we will, I guess, I'm not sure the path to do that. Maybe it's an email. I'm not sure, like just Thomas know maybe what to do next.
Alois, now you are very silent.
Yes, because I muted myself while I was typing. You know, 1 week off of meetings and suddenly you have to learn back all of those skills of muting and unmuting you. What I wanted to say, I'll put it into the TOC update next week. So if you can send me the final link of the entire document, I'll just put this into the TOC update. Then they have it available as well.
Okay, and should we write out something on the TOC mailing list, or would you do this, or whoever should do this? Because I saw the security tag also created a white paper, and they announced also the public comment phase on the TOC mailing list.
I will do it after Tuesday maybe. So wait
Okay.
for the feedback from the TOCs. I put it into the tag update. And also we wanted to start the public comment phase and see whether there's any feedback on how this should be handled from them. And based on their feedback, we can then do it next week, Wednesday.
Okay, perfect.
That would be my proposal. Because I feel like we're again in some area where there is some sort of process, but it's not officially documented. So that's why I'd rather get the feedback first.
But the security tag created a kind of a procedure for publishing white papers, and I think we should follow this as far as possible, because I think they know best of us how to write white papers.
Yeah, I just want to double check. I mean, it's not a big deal, but then you can officially share it just on the TOC mailing list. So I don't expect them to object anything there. Okay, an application enablement charter. Who wants to take this one? I think that's pretty much everything from the operator white paper. I'd assume it's pretty much done.
I can take this.
Yeah. The only other question: do we then officially also want to dissolve the operator working group? I mean,
I think so, yes.
done?
Sorry?
I mean, if you think we're like done, that we can just say it does no longer exist.
To be honest, there are not much contributors in this working group, and therefore I think after we publish the white paper, it's almost done. So if nobody has any objections, I would dissolve this afterwards.
Which is fine, which is what working groups kind of exist for. So they have a dedicated charter to produce something, which in this case was this white paper, and it's done, and now they can more or less move on to do other things. I think that's totally fine. I would just make it official and then ensure that like the calendar entries done.
Yes, and I think we could also do the maintenance of the white paper outside of a working group. So that's absolutely no problem. So if there are any updates for the operator white paper or other topics, we could do this outside of a working group.
Yeah, I think it's fine. But then we would just remove it from the calendars. There are no official meetings anymore, so that's fine. It's more or less an administration type of item, but we should not forget about it because otherwise it would accumulate it. And also to justify why we're creating yet another working group, we could say, well, we're resolving one, moving on to a different topic, which I think is fine. Okay, application enablement.
Yes, let me share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I have a big screen. So
Perfect. So I think that the format here is we can walk through it with you and you can pick out any questions and we can revisit anything that needs to be clarified. I think the walkthrough of this document will take 5 to 10 minutes. And Jennifer and Thomas, please feel free to add to anything that I say. I'm going to intend to give essentially an overview, but we can dig into some detail and express some additional thoughts whilst we're on the sections. So the application enablement working group culminated as the result of many interested parties who wanted to find a common vernacular for describing the space between our minimal infrastructure deployment and the applications on which reside on them. And this isn't new news to anybody within this group, but I thought I'd clarify it. The problem statement essentially expresses here that there is a very nebulous and ill-defined way of expressing how to deploy an application across providers. And when I say providers, that could mean physical infrastructure providers, that can mean cloud providers. And this ranges from taxonomy of word. This could be also the methodology of provisioning. And so in this problem statement, we've given some examples of some simple everyday tasks that are made difficult by lack of ubiquity across these systems. So developers who want to use something like EFS as a backend for the application and also use that same EFS methodology in their dev environment are challenged with having two separate systems, two different pipelines and ways of going about that. There is not a simplistic way of describing this, or there's not a simple, I would say, best practice for how you should be going about this. Equally, when they think about adapting those packages to use a storage class within the development environment, there's a differentiation between what is in a higher tier. And as you can see in these points, as this gets shipped to the next stage, there'll be no storage class available in this higher environment because the storage class differs. This also is reminiscent of things like setting a storage class to a local path. And for those not familiar, I'm using the example within Kubernetes for when you want to mount a data volume, and you might have one type of volume locally and one type remotely. And this is a typical scenario that you'll see. Another one that we thought was quite good was ingress and actually making an application available to the wider world. So the problem as defined here is that there are a multitude of ways to combine application workloads and infrastructure, but very few of them are transferable from either a local development environment or across cloud providers. In addition, we think about the CI/CD pipeline and how there is a lot of institutional knowledge for not only the application composition, whether that's secret management, injection of configuration, but then also deployment onto the cloud providers or self-hosted providers underneath that. And as we'll go on to describe, there are some attempts from various vendors and from various working groups and projects to solve some of these problems, but there is not a condensement of knowledge and examples about how to do this. in addition, there is an assumption that infrastructure is always available. And we believe that there needs to be a way that we can describe an immutable state of this is what I need. And then we can start to look at how can we resolve these provisioning issues. And when I say we need to start thinking about resolving it, as we'll go on to describe at the end of this document, we're not looking to build a panacea here. This working group is very much focused on what are the real problems. We want to really shine a light on where things break down, where are the gaps, where are the frustrations of engineers. And then we will collate that feedback. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. And so just to finish off this initial problem statement of the difficulties of describing infrastructure across environments, across clouds, the varying methodologies, whether it's a GitOps-based mechanism in the deployment pipeline, there are very few ways that systems agree to come together to create a essentially application first or developer first experience. We are seeing some efforts to be able to take a container or to take a package to do something like auto DevOps and deploy it out. But there are many different variations on this, and mileage may vary. And so lastly, in this stanza here, we talk about there are no really ubiquitous best practices. And I've said that a few times in various ways throughout my, my illustration here. But part of the goal, as we'll go on to talk about, is to really look at what are the emergent practices, what are vendors building towards, what are the things that projects like Argo, Flux, Keptin, Crossplane, Terraform, what are these things doing? How are people using them in the financial industry? How are people using them in the technology industry? And so this really segues into this idea of what are the combinations of tooling available out there, and how do they aim to resolve this? And so this very simple then, which is wonderfully naive, at the same time is very powerful because it does illustrate this gap. Whether it's Pulumi with Flux, whether it's Argo with Terraform, being able to deploy a workload is not the dominion of one of these alone. You cannot run Argo CD without having the infrastructure on which to deploy it. Equally, there is no point having Crossplane if you have no application workloads to run on it. And so there are some intersecting concerns here. And we think this is exciting because it's an opportunity for many of the participants within the projects mentioned here to bring to light how they can see compatibility between these projects. And again, I think about things like OAM in the back of my mind as some of the prior art today in terms of how can we start to bring an interesting and more holistic ecosystem. Talking about prior art and things that have already been set up, if we look at the examples of known solutions, and I thank Robert as well. I don't believe he's on this call, but he helped us to fill in some of these. We had things like Ketch and Kubevela and Shipper into these application deployment methodologies on top of these very, very well-trodden paths of Terraform and the now very exciting Crossplane proposition. It's extremely interesting in how the end user is actually digesting this. The technology stacks are starting to outpace people quite quickly. And so what we're seeing and what we're hoping to understand is how are people adapting to this? We have infinite choice now, but being able to describe a workload and deploy it and actually having enough infrastructure to do just the right thing is still an interesting and quite complex task. So with everything I've just said there, how does this actually align with the goal of the tag? Well, in many sense, the definition and the actual explanation here, I think, is quite well put. So I'll just read this line. So as application delivery often coupled with underlying infrastructure, it can often impact package formats and the application delivery workflow. And this we've described prior to this. This topic around this idea of definition, description, parameter configuration, all falls into the remit of app delivery because it's part of the idea of bundling and deployment and the sort of delivery workflow and strategy within the SIG's charter topics. So there's a very close alignment, and that's why we feel that natural synergy would be something that we could explore within this group and really help to leverage some of the interest areas of the wider tag and to really shine a light and exemplify some of the industry best practices. And so with that said, what are the actual tangible outcomes of this working group? Capturing the current landscape practices. So that's talking to end users, focus groups, conversations, interviews. Focus on balancing the involvement of personas in the application and management enablement arena. So this specifically is a very interesting point because we want to understand that it's not just SREs who are building infrastructure. It's not just developers who are deploying workloads. There are some hybrid personas of folks who are not only building, but then deploying. The scale of your company will have a magnification effect on whether or not you're going to be doing one or the other. Often it might be a detractor and you'll just be doing deployment and vice versa. Either way, that has a significant influence on the future of the ecosystem. The third point, provide an interoperability examples between IAC, so infrastructure as code, and continuous delivery tools in a code repository. This, we think about using projects such as Potato Head to really exemplify how are people using the tooling within the landscape. How do you knit these things together? How do I take a chart or a manifest, and how do I build a GitOps platform that can consume that on top of some infrastructure to enable me to present my business? And finally, provide successful patterns in a white paper based on practical work, not a king-making process of saying this is how it's done, but more a white paper in a similar vein to the operator group where we analyze recurrent patterns of behavior and best practices. And so lastly, more of an admin part of this document, the working mode and expected outcomes. We'll meet to discuss plans, concepts, we'll develop demo infrastructure as mentioned, and create essentially an MVP for various patterns that will invite project maintainers and contributors to get involved with. And this will be inevitably and ultimately for the end user benefit. So they can refer to this project and say, this is how we can see such and such a GitOps process on top of this cloud provider or this platform working. And as mentioned prior to this, we have end user interviews, landscape radar, contribution of IAC and CI/CD tooling workflows, and a white paper, all as part of our ambition. And so that really covers the high level outline of this document. And I think at this point, I'll just invite Thomas or Jennifer, if you want to add anything to what I've already said, you'd be very welcome to do so.
So I think you said everything, and yes, for me it's really nice possibility to bring infrastructure and application developers more together to find out how IC and app delivery tools can interact and so on. And yes, I think this would be a funny working group.
Yeah, so I think with that said, unless Jennifer, you had any other points, we could open it up if there are any questions.
Now I'm unmuting myself. See, I'm learning again, retraining my muscle memory here.
I have a question. One thing that we talked about, this is a while ago, about application enablement, was that the result wouldn't be a white paper. But now we're saying that the goal is a white paper. So yeah, how did that decision happen?
Yeah, Thomas or Jennifer, do you want to speak a little to it? Otherwise, I'm happy to give it a go.
I didn't understand the question, to be honest.
So the question I think Matthew was asking there is, prior conversations, there hadn't been the indication of there being a white paper being written. However, now in the initial goals, we have stated that a white paper should be one of the products. And he was just asking a little bit around that decision process and why that's there.
One of the first goals of the first ideas of this working group was that we don't want to create a white paper at first. So at first we want to give end users something they can work with. So examples of configurations, of how to implement such infrastructures and app delivery things. And afterwards, after we have felt the pain ourselves, and after we have found out what could be done better or could be a good pattern for implementing this, then I think we are able to write a white paper and could provide also our experience to the end users, and yes, make their lives easier. So this was if this answers your question.
Just to add to that very briefly, one of the really exciting prospects of the white paper for tag observability was that we saw a lot of vendor contribution as well as end user contribution, and it actually helped to fuel, in a sort of cyclical sense, the interview process and the participation within the working group. And I think, just to add to what Thomas was saying about this kind of being almost like a last step before we wind the group down, it's not just about our experiences as individuals, but hopefully looking at getting some of these projects and maintainers of these projects to work together to say, okay, cluster API with crossplane, et cetera, and let's use that within GitOps, and looking at how we start to see that become something we can actually codify into a practical white paper that exemplifies some of these techniques. So maybe kind of the confusion, and maybe something we could work on, is how we word this to say that this is essentially the last step in the goals of this group, if that makes sense.
Great, yeah. So that makes sense. I was just wondering, it seems like a project like this, it would be good to kind of formulate some sort of standard or something like that for how, app enablement could be done. Similar, do you see in a similar way to SMI tries to standardize service meshes, do you think this could be something you would investigate?
I think, if I can speak for everyone who's been involved in this, that I think that's probably one of our non-goals, actually. We're not looking to create a 14th standard kind of thing. I think it's going to be an area, and maybe we will think about that conversation again, but initially, as an initial set of goals, it's definitely not something we've steered away from for a variety of reasons. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would even say right now we wouldn't even in detail know what the standard should be for exactly. Like if you would start with the standard work, you would, I think, not necessarily be entirely sure what you want to standardize. And also to your point, Alex, the way I see it, you move into a more and more opinionated way. If you look at frameworks, but it's Kubela, it's Catch and others, and I'm not using opinionated in a negative way. It's just a specific way of doing things. That's how I mean it. Which on the one hand makes certain things easier to do, obviously, but it also creates some kind of technology lock-in and incompatibility that might be by design and by choice. I think the question is to find, okay, where do the individual approaches where should they start, and where should some compatibility be? Maybe it's just at the core Kubernetes primitive. So we say every tool at the end of the day needs to output what is available in Kubernetes by default, which it technically needs, otherwise it can't run it. With some exceptions, obviously, because if you look at Crossplane, obviously, it uses a CRD, but it configures a system that's entirely outside of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
I like the approach. I like capturing the current state. I think is the current problems to be solved at the current state of where projects are helpful is something I like. I know we started working, or we had the intent to work on a landscape before. I always see landscape as a very interesting thing. Landscapes are a way to get a lot of people out of this meeting. So if we would work on the application delivery landscape, we would be maybe 50 people in this meeting for 2 or 3 weeks, because a lot of DevRel people and a lot of marketing people will suddenly be tasked to participate and ensure that their logo is there. Which is fair, which is what people do, so not judging here. On the other hand, if I'm an end user and if I look at pretty much every landscape out there, it isn't usually helping me a lot. Like there are like 5 tools in there, like 5 logos in there, say for CD, but what does this mean? There are like a couple of logos in there for, say, templating and other steps in there. That's why I think having what tools can do overview that I would not necessarily call landscape, I think it's super helpful, and where they overlap. We started to do this. It turns out to be an incredible amount of work, and you run into like a lot of overlaps and a lot of unclear classifications, which might be a good thing as well. So
Yeah, that's a great point.
that's why I think we should combine maybe goals with, we shouldn't mix goals with deliverables to say, okay, what do we want to achieve for us internally, or like for moving the application delivery space for CNCF App Delivery forward, and what's the output for an end user? That might make sense. It's usually not always done that way, but in this case it might be helpful. And maybe they're the same anyways. And yeah, I think the first point is great. Like just noting down, like these are the, I don't know, 200 decisions or things you have to take care of if you want to ship cloud native applications. Very high level. And this is, and then putting also tools in there in a way that I'm the end user and I have this problem, or I have this task at hand. It's not necessarily a problem. What can I use, and how will this product or this project do it? Also, something that I found interesting from this what came out in a couple of other CNCF tech creators, that people usually don't look like for that one tool to do everything. It's more like a best of breed and mix and match type of approach. Like, what's the input and output of a tool? Can I even combine those two tools together? That's something that I found interesting when starting to look into Potato Head. And okay, that there are some tools that have a well-defined, that can work with a well-defined input, which might be a Helm chart or manifest, and then manage certain capabilities. And then there are other tools that have pretty much their own syntax for input, and then they do everything with operators and so forth fully automatically. There's no way to bring anything else in there, because they try to do like everything end to end, and they're not to that extent open at all, and like other capabilities cannot simply plug into. Again, not saying that one is better than the other, but I think that would also be helpful for people to say, yeah, you can use this here, combine it with this, because the outputs are kind of compatible. And that might be something, not a standard that comes out of it, to say, well, the output of an application packaging process should always be this. Even if you keep it internally, I want to be able to extract this if I want to do something differently with it. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting as well. Like, I think that your point around this may lead to a standard, I think that's absolutely true. You know, the idea of mix and match is so poignant right now, because that certainly is how people are selecting. And I come back to the idea of observability, you know, and the idea of the OTel system came out of things like open metrics and open census, you know, the convergence of multiple standards into something that was a little bit more ubiquitous and a little bit more democratized. It could be the case that we find that there are some quite opinionated projects like Crossplane that have XDR, I think it's called, XRD, I forget. But, you know, and then we can see that there are parallels in other projects, and it might be that something comes out of that. So I think this is going to shine a light on something that is fairly prevalent. Lots of people are doing it. Lots of people are trying to create stuff. I mean, we saw Lagoon again a few weeks back as a presentation. And I think that we will start to shake the tree a bit doing this. And I think it'll be a very, very useful exercise.
Yeah, I think it's also super helpful for a lot of people taking technology decisions. Like, what are you deciding for right now? Because this is a space where there's a lot of movement. A lot of companies have to take strategic decisions. and it's hard to take the right strategic decision right now. But you might put a couple of hundred or even thousands of developers on the path that in 2 years down the road you might realize was not the go-to path. I mean, not to bash on any technologies, but there were like a lot of folks who were focusing massively on Cloud Foundry when Kubernetes was emerging. So that might not feel that good today anyways. Not saying it's a bad technology. I think it had some... A lot of the things we are building right now in the Kubernetes space reminds me of a lot of things that were already there in Cloud Foundry, and some projects made it over, like Cloud Native build packs.
So you are saying like I mean, what you said before when Alex was putting the comments, that like adding to our like output, like capabilities and like requirements and pros and cons of each, and also use cases. Like I guess the white paper could contain some, or if it's some other thing that we decided to do, like use cases because of the interview. So we will have some of these like data and then be able to then surface like the capabilities and what workarounds people are taking now or doing now. So yeah, if that was what you meant with the capabilities when you said we could use the interviews to create those use cases. And
yeah, I think just by when people tell you what they're using a certain product for. We use it only for deployment. No, we don't use it for modification. You can use certain products for a lot of things and only for a small subset. And I think that because just describing the space or just describing cloud native application delivery and everything that needs to happen is complex by itself. And there is no model. At the very beginning of the working group, Harry built up this model that you're referring to as well, regarding like definition, packaging, delivery, and so forth. We didn't cover infrastructure definition in there that much. And I think that by itself is like, what are these individual things that people are doing? Like, what are these like atomic distinct blocks that people see in their process, in their tool chains, in the steps that they're doing? Obviously, you can always say I'm building a container, I'm deploying it, I'm running it, but also how they see it. For example, is delivery and rollout necessarily the same tool, or is it entirely different? I think it depends on who you ask.
It's interesting as well. Like, I think one of the things that keeps going through my mind right now is that this is essentially driving home a barometer of how interoperable is the cloud native ecosystem, right? Like how many of these projects have interoperability with each other, and we're just sort of polarizing them between application delivery and infrastructure concerns. But really, it's a far more introspective question. You know, how are people using these tools is essentially going to answer the question of which, you know, what sort of direction is the future heading in. And, you know, a lot of prevalence around this idea of going to small clusters that are self-managed with GitOps-based approach is really giving us a bit of an emergent trend point of view through this working group. So again, that's one of the outcomes that I think is going to be probably more anecdotal, but I think it's super vital, like you said, for strategic decisions.
And that's also a good point. Usually it's, however, hard to get the end user interviews. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I think we should just clearly come up with a plan on how to reach the end users, because usually the CNCF has a good relationship with its end users, but it is often very hard to get them to engage even more, because they like ask for service all the time. I think we like especially that this group here is well connected, that we can get some people together, can get started on this. I think we should just have the critical mass and feel comfortable that we know enough companies who are willing to talk about this. even if it's like not in public, just mentioning what they're using, but not necessarily being mentioned for this. That's for me like a critical success factor there. I remember we started this with air-gapped, and everybody was super excited about air-gapped, and then nobody wanted to talk about their air-gapped deployments. So at the end, it was one company who really shared how they're doing it. We might find a bit more openness here, and I think this also jumps into goes into my next comment. I would also actively invite the projects that are part of this to that working group and have them discuss it. Some of them are obviously already in there. Some of them are not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point.
This is just reaching out. What do you think about what we're doing here?
Regarding the strategy to reach out to people, I guess so far we are trying to talk to the people that we kind of like have more connections with. Like I, for example, used to be part of the end user group when I used to work for Condé Nast. They are an end user, so I have ex-colleagues that are willing to talk to me, and we can do interviews. So and there's vendor now in VMware, also my team, because we use as well. So we are, so that's how like we'll get started from this side. And maybe other companies that are not yet end users, but I know that are intending to do that. So like basically reaching out to people that we know that work in companies and that are willing to share some things. I guess with spreading the force with the other people, we might get a few companies to do that.
Yeah, in addition, like there's the GitOps working group, isn't there? That has a lot of interested parties that would probably be quite happy to set apart what their particular offering is and who potentially some of their customers are, with their permission, of course, to give kind of almost like case study examples of how they are using their tooling and products. So that might be worth us exploring as well. I think Tracy, Tracy Reagan, who she's from CDF, was on one of these calls a few weeks back, and she might be a really good person to contact. She has a good relationship, I believe, with a lot of these folks.
Yeah, and obviously we can also always reach out to the working group chairs directly and ask them, hey, because it's totally orthogonal, it's related to what they're doing on, but the contents are significantly different. I mean, this is not to steal your thunder, but that's what you usually see them. If you have the project jumping in there, because as you have already seen with the operator working group, you have always a massive drop-off. That's kind of what I learned here. And what you will also see sometimes in the working groups, that suddenly a lot of people show up because they have some very specific interest, and then they drop off once their interest is met, which is fair. Everybody of us has too many meetings. That's totally okay.
Yeah, and I think, go on, Jen.
Thank you. So in my, I agree with that. And yeah, we experienced that in the operator working group for sure. Like we know the pain. What I suggest with that, like I intend to do more this time around, learning from that, is we should have what we need, like know what we need before reaching out, the information. So the user interviews, like we need to kind of just get it like set first, so we can, when reaching out and people are willing to give their attention, you don't like need them to be like consistently participating for a long time and then like maybe lose the momentum, like, so we should try to know exactly what information we need Of course, we will iterate, but then like in the next interview, so then people will just like provide what we need, and then like they will, when they have their attention, we try to get everything. It's like that's how I for example, with the operator working group, some people wanted to help, but we were like, okay, you could contribute with what you would like, but then maybe suggest something, a small piece deliverable easily, and then like if they were willing to do that in one, some people would be able to, you know, like to fulfill that. That's more just the technique. In my mind, one suggestion that comes from what I learned. Of course, maybe other people have other ideas. Maybe Aloha, you have some as well.
Yes. So what I learned over like working on standards and these kind of things for a very long time, people usually contribute if they have a very personal interest in the things that they're doing. Not saying that people don't do things altruistically, but the closer something is aligned to what you're working on anyways, the more likely to you are contributing to it, because you're more or less doing the work that you want to do anyways. That's why it might maybe make sense for like those use cases and scenarios that we'll over list a couple of those, and then specifically work on them. Like, how do you like manage your infrastructure requirements configuration along, say, with your with your application configuration? You have some examples in there, but if you say like these are like 5 questions that we will start working on, and assuming that we pick the interesting questions that people care about, they will join this discussion, because the problem that they have, they want to listen to other people who already worked on this. If they build something interesting, they might be willing to present what they interestingly built. And it's way more practical. That's also why like you put the white paper to the end, like also with the app delivery, sorry, with the operator working group. A white paper is always very hard, because it really doesn't add the people, that doesn't provide an equivalent in value to the people who write it, then they necessarily get out of it. It's a lot of work to get there, but once you have the high level idea, you got everything out of it, then there's still a lot of work left. So I think if you can think, especially in the beginning, of tasks that are low to medium input required from people, but have high value for them, are actually, I think, the best we can pick. That's how you usually keep people engaged. Like if you would discuss like 3 ways on a comparison of the 3 ways on how you can manage infrastructure in a Kubernetes environment, you might invite the project people over. That would be, by the way, a great video that we as the tag would have, that we can share online, that would draw additional interest to what we're doing. Easy to produce, high value, and for the people who are initially contributing, very low effort. So that might be something to think about, because that's easy. Like if you would ask, for example, the cross-plane people, how are you doing it, and you talk to a couple of other people who do infrastructure based on Kubernetes, they will all be very willing to share what they do, some high-level concepts. We put them all in one meeting. You have 5 presentations. You put this out to the wider audience, point them to other resources that we have. I think you create some momentum that will eventually also lead to some critical mass, and you pick like one topic after the other. It still needs to be curated, obviously. Somebody needs to bring them on board and motivates them, but these are usually the easier thing. The plus side for you, if you eventually want to write an overview of the landscape and eventually a white paper, that a lot of the research work for that you otherwise needed to do is done by other people. So there might be like a win-win situation in there. I know the observability group is looking into doing blog posts, some type of video series, and these kind of things. And that might be something like listing the top 10 problems that are on top of your mind that we want to discuss, and how people manage it. I mean, you have obviously also the experience what people usually run into. Just start there. We can always, as we go along, change which ones we want to work on. If one's becoming more important, we can prioritize it up. If one becomes less important, we prioritize it down.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially the low effort, high value contributions part. I think as much as we can to incentivize projects to participate is going to be really key. And actually, this is why I think, perhaps to Matthew's question, this is why maybe the white paper is actually valuable as well, is that they can, from a marketing perspective, see that they've been given the opportunity to look at their interoperability with other technologies and share the stories of how their users are sort of operating, and potentially be part of the publicized group that are looking at working towards not only exemplifying this, but also sort of solving eventually for perhaps some of the more practical challenges.
And also with those projects, you can open it up to the problems that you want to list and have this priority list. Because usually every problem has a very specific problem. So every project has a very specific or a couple of very specific problems that they want to solve. So they have a reason why they exist. And then it's more or less about curating them and what they want to solve. You obviously have to go in a couple of rounds. Like, the problem that application delivery on Kubernetes is too complex is not the granularity that you want to have there. I mean, that's still a bit superficial. But as you go deeper and be more specific, I think you can really get there. I know this is actually making more work than it takes out of it. But I think, yeah, let's say if we just have an overview of application definition approaches, like a very short demo, and then maybe put them online somewhere, which we can as a working group. That's also what the GitOps working group started to do, to produce educational content. In this case, also like small educational content. Some of this might be already available. That's kind of what the potato head to some extent turned into as well. Like, it's this collection of doing one very specific thing, task in 10 plus different ways. Which would be something else actually we could put in there, because now all the examples need to be redone anyways, because there's now the distributed version with 5 microservices, which is way more interesting than it used to be.
Yeah, I've not contributed anything to that in a while, so I'll have a look.
At the Litmus people, because they use it for network chaos testing. Now, like, arms and legs are different services. It sounds always funny when you mention it, but that's actually the way it is. Yeah, was this helpful? Can I help?
This is fantastic. So I think we will need to meet again this week, and we might make some small adjustments, perhaps, to based on your comments here. I think, me personally, the thing that Jennifer and yourself said that actually really resonated with me, something I hadn't thought about, was how do we actually drive active participation and high engagement, and make use of that while we have it early on. So that's something that I think we need to think about. As for the document, if you think in general it looks pretty good, I'll make some small tweaks to it, and we can then get it ready for the sort of presentation.
Yeah, and I think we can take some of the work that they're doing in SIG observability as a blueprint. So usually we can publish materials. We just need to let the CNCF know, not that it's a big deal per se, but some of the marketing obviously is always reserved to paying members, while all the projects we engage here are obviously CNCF projects per se mostly. But would you say no to a small project that's not a CNCF project and has something interesting to show? Most likely not. But I think that's... And sharing different approaches, maybe also different stacks. So if somebody's really interested and we find people who want to write about it, like after an interview, which would be positive, like, which stack are you running? What are you using tools for? I think a lot of people want to learn. They want to see, okay, what other people are using, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. That's maybe they're redoing I think the goals all stay there. Maybe the deliverables become like smaller, and back in the first one, just capturing the practices for just giving 10 examples or 5 examples that you want to start with. And maybe then we also find a better name.
You still hate the name? Oh, there's a bunch of suggestions at the end.
I know, I'm not hating it. I mean, hating would be like a very active negative feeling
Okay.
against something. That's
Well,
not what I'm having in there.
this can be
That doesn't
a.
click with me. It's like this passive. Oh, like yeah,
We have come up with a few names here. So I think it needs the people on this call can certainly help us. We're not wed to it, but Jennifer and Thomas and I have we've exhausted our ideas on this.
I really like application enablement.
I'm not worried about the name. I'm always more worried about the work that's done somewhere, honestly, and having like a solid execution plan for something. Having the best name in the world and not knowing what to do is usually worse than the other way around.
I'm flexible. I was joking.
Yeah, I think people, if they read application enablement, they would not immediately know what this is about. So they would need to read the description. I think that's the only thing why I'm not like super much a fan. Like, is the thing enabling application in Kubernetes? And then you think,
it's a very good point, because it's also a very difficult thing to describe.
Yeah, so you read it, you kind of understand it, but if somebody forced you to put it in like one single sentence what the application enablement working group is doing, it is still incredibly hard. I think we all are here. We kind of have this agreement what it is about, but like that usual back in the days, and hopefully the days soon to come, when you sit next into an airplane and they would ask you what it is, or we're having a not so amazing airplane dinner, what would you tell them without like starting off a 1 hour conversation?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we did like the idea of pattern kept coming up recurrently. Pattern, experience, these kind of this kind of taxonomy of words. I think we're getting close to it.
And again, this won't really restrict us from moving forward here. And I think we can also have these discussions right now as part of the main meeting here as well more. There are no project reviews right now scheduled, so we can use this meeting slot, and it might also draw more people here, hopefully also more end users.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Getting to some of those presentations where people show how they do certain things. I think a side by side of Sheepa and Kubevela would be nice, like in one session. That we give you both the same problem, show how you do it. It's not competing. It's just show us your approach versus the other approach, and then let people ask questions. It was just one example. You could pick other tools, obviously, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite a compelling way to get people to participate, actually having these comparison meetings where we can really dig into how the same problem is solved in different ways.
Yeah. I was just wondering whether I could actually use Cluster API, for example, with a commercial distribution like OpenShift. Or I could even use Cluster API to configure my Zero cluster. I mean, Cluster API is great, but can I use it for anything except vanilla Kubernetes?
Yeah, and then that's the narrative, and then what's all the glue between it, right? So it's not just that, is it? It's deploy cluster API. So oh, someone joined. Go ahead. Okay, perhaps it was an error. But yeah, essentially, just like you were saying, it's all the glue between as well, which is the concern of the working group is, what is the toil involved in actually describing how you provision on that particular infrastructure for this workload. And so I think that's something that we're going to learn as we go.
Yeah, and also what do have to learn on top of what they already know. So that's why I think also we describe maybe you have a couple of personas in there, but say let's describe our persona as somebody who's maybe either a developer or a platform operator who understands how Kubernetes works and how you can maybe configure plain Kubernetes. That's their skill set. Like they have a CKA, CKD. That's what they have. That's what they know. What are the things they have to learn on top? Yeah. And not because it's coming from me, I think that would be actually really interesting, because that would show us, okay, what don't we teach those people to actually deliver applications on Kubernetes with the tools and frameworks out there?
Do you mean like specific tool and framework, like the learning curve for these tools and frameworks?
Exactly. What do I need to know that I don't already know as somebody who basically understands Kubernetes? I would always say that the people understand Kubernetes. I think that would be my baseline. A CKA and CKD is something that people should be familiar with, depending on their roles. So this is what they understand about it. And you might argue that especially larger organizations will have people who are not experts in Kubernetes. Yes, but then they technically have to learn a new framework anyways entirely. But how much additional do they have to learn? How much can they reuse from what they know? So, for example, if I am a CKD and I want to use OAM with kubevela, what do I have to learn? And which other tools do I have to learn on top to create, or tool categories do I have to learn on top to get these things done? Because that might be interesting.
And I feel like we're almost getting into the remit of understanding a metric for this, or understanding some sort of recurrent way of measuring this, because learning those technologies is one thing, doing those on a VMware-based solution is another, and then doing it on a cloud provider is yet another. And that kind of institutional knowledge development and toil for the particular snapshot or your vertical is something that's very, very difficult to express. It's very difficult to measure, but yet it's something we all feel, right? Like there are some technology stacks that just click, and they just click together in a way that works. And that interoperability I keep coming back to is something that I feel we can start to think about quantifying, maybe not with a scalar, but at least we could do it in a kind of a heuristic where we can say, how was your experience?
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, because that's what I sometimes find interesting when people say, well, you can use an ingress to easily expose a service in your Kubernetes cluster. And the answer is yes, that's theoretically true. But if you're running in AWS, in GCP, or in Azure, your experience is entirely different to really see the thing on the internet. Because just the fact how to get an IP is significantly different that you can reuse and share. And also, how well are these things available? So what is allowed on a certain platform?
Yeah, sounds good.
But yeah, that I think we are getting somewhere. But that's who I would put in there as the key stakeholder here. I remember when we started the operator white paper. Some people were claiming they wanted to write a white paper for their boss who is not technical, doesn't know what Kubernetes is, and they have to explain to them why they should write an operator. So yeah, I feel your pain. I think we can't really solve it for you, unfortunately.
What do you think about, for example, so when I got to the level of CKA, CKAD, CKA, I still didn't know much about like CRDs at all. Like it was before. And then like in my previous job, for example, I used AWS, Terraform. So like I had to create some resources and stuff like that, like Prometheus and stuff. But like I didn't have to think about custom resource definitions and stuff. And some stuff like cross-plane now, like people who have this knowledge more is like easier to use, would you consider that some sort of bar of entry, or would it be within your like Kubernetes? I understand Kubernetes now, I can create resources. In your opinion, just curious.
My opinion, I'm happy to hear ask it. Yes, you understand how to create a CRD, but a CRD is more or less its own definition. That's to that extent proprietary again. If I don't know what I should write there, I have to learn something new. The key concept of a CRD should not be new to you, what it does. But what's in the CRD is still very domain specific.
Yeah, good point. Okay.
I think the answer is,
Makes
do you
sense.
need to read any docs that you haven't read before? Then it's new. But you brought up an interesting point. Which tools are people usually familiar with when they come to these problems? So also to what Alex said in his diagram. They come with Terraform knowledge. Does this help them at all? If they have to put everything into a CRD, not really. If the CRD uses a specific format that they're not familiar with, okay, yeah, let me know if I can help on anything there. We are beyond the hour, and I don't want to keep you.
No, thank you so much. This is very useful. We'll schedule a session prior to the one next week you mentioned with the CNCF.
Yeah, and I would just reach out to some of the projects and see what their feedback is. So some, like the cross-plane people, might be interested in contributing. So you will always see some people are not, depending on how busy they are.
Yeah.
This is exciting. Okay, I think we meet again next week. Thank you for joining today, and wish you a pleasant evening or rest of the day, depending on time zones, as always.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.